raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him up to be my pride and joy. Who dared to place a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy. Let nations operate their future trouble. It's time to lay the sword and gun away. There'd be no war today if mothers all would say, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier.
Hi. Hello and good evening. Welcome to the Oregon Historical Society. My name's Eliza Canty-Jones. I'm so pleased to have you all here this evening. We have been planning for many months, and I'm really excited for tonight's presentation, so thanks for being here. I should say that the mission of the Oregon Historical Society is to preserve our state's history and to make it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all of the peoples, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. And we do this work in a wide variety of ways. We have obviously public programs like this one. We have our museum here in downtown Portland, and there are 3 floors of museum exhibits. Our research library, which has a ginormous collection of material related to the history of the Oregon country and is open to the public 32 hours a week. Our digital programs, the Oregon History Project and the Oregon Encyclopedia, available online. And of course, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, published continuously by OHS since 1900. We are funded in a wide variety of ways. I want to thank our members who are here in the audience. We really appreciate your funding. And also Multnomah County residents who voted in May to renew a modest property tax levy, oh wow, May a year ago, that supports the Oregon Historical Society, and we're really grateful for that. Tonight's program kicks off, or is part of our World War I Centennial series. You can see video of the first 2 programs on our website. The series is a collaborative creation by me and Dr. Christopher McKnight-Nichols and Dr. Kimberly Jensen, and it will culminate with a publication next month in the Oregon Historical Quarterly. Let me now turn to introducing our speakers so we can get started. Our first speaker will be Kimberly Jensen, who's professor of history and gender studies at Western Oregon University. She is author of Mobilizing Minerva, American Women in the First World War, and she is completing a book project called Civic Borderlands. After Kimberly will be Dr. Stephen Sabol, who is associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And then speaking after him will be Dr. Adriane Lentz-Smith, who is associate professor of history, women's studies, and African American studies at Duke University. Please join me in welcoming Kimberly Jensen.
A little bit more. How's that? Good evening, everyone. I'm so honored to be on this panel tonight with Professor Lentz-Smith and Professor Sabol. Many thanks to the Oregon Historical Society, to the staff, to Eliza Canty-Jones, to the librarians up on that 4th floor where the treasures are, and to the many archivists who have been of help to me with this project, and to my colleagues and friends who are such a help to me in my work and my life. This map of women's suffrage before the 19th Amendment shows an array of voting rights for women by state, one aspect of citizenship, and hard won by activists. But the map does not illustrate that the effects of discrimination, racism, poverty, illiteracy, and the need for English language skills created barriers to the polls. In addition, most women and men in tribal communities could not vote until the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, and among them, U.S. citizenship and voting was a contested issue. First-generation Asian women and men could not vote until during and after World War II. And as historian Margot Kennedy demonstrates, policymakers were gradually working to construct a boundary in law and policy to define homosexuals and queer people as anti-citizens. Following their 1912 victory, Oregon, yay! Oregon activists turned to work on the 19th Amendment, which would be achieved after the World War in 1920, and to other elements of citizenship such as jury service and office holding. In my previous work, I investigated U.S. women doctors and nurses and other women who wanted to enter the military as part of a more complete female citizenship in World War I, and also one-woman physician's wartime experience that propelled her into medical humanitarian work after World War I. So I'd like to share some of my new research with you tonight and the World War I aspect of that. The First World War came in the midst of these negotiations for a more complete female citizenship. Uncle Sam asked men to enlist. Lady Liberty asked everyone to purchase Liberty bonds here in these two posters. In addition, there was more state surveillance and federal surveillance than ever before. Wartime legislation, including the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, criminalized free speech with steep fines and imprisonment. The state and state agents placed extreme pressure on individuals and groups to support the war efforts with new imperatives for citizenship or as unquestioning loyalty to the government, and for those citizens to surveil and report on their neighbors. This is going all right. I draw on the ideas of a number of scholars to emphasize three elements of citizenship that were really in play in this period. One was the status of citizenship, such as voting rights or jury service acquired through legislation or policy. The second was the practice of citizenship, illustrated here by these women who are taking part in, and people who are taking part in, the pageantry and parades of fundraising. This was visible 100% Americanism for women, patriotic womanhood and motherhood, expressed in support of wartime programs. And then third, a social citizenship of shared duties and experiences, a civic role that some women of color and women in some immigrant communities used to claim a more complete citizenship, as did white women who compared their wartime service with that of men. I'd like to provide a brief overview of 4 wartime registrations. There will be a test at the end, so please, I'm kidding. We're still in session. Of 4 wartime registrations and canvassing, in which women were involved as active participants, but also as objects of the campaigns. Wartime female registration, the food pledge, Liberty loans, and also enemy alien registration. Some Oregon women participated in the practice of citizenship in these many wartime drives and registrations, but these same activities also sent some women as agents of the growing surveillance state into the homes and rooming houses of others to gather information for what the Oregonian referred to as Uncle Sam's identification archives. Other women recast the practice of citizenship to suit their own goals, and some women resisted these programs and policing and helped to establish alternative claims for women's citizenship in wartime and beyond. The Women's Committee of the Council of National Defense wanted all women to register for possible wartime service as a demonstration of their loyalty in the practice of citizenship, and some women in Oregon agreed. Sadie Orr Dunbar, facilitator of Portland's registration, believed registration was a great day in the lives of Portland women that would demonstrate that women's service to the state was equivalent to men's service. Beatrice Kennedy, Black activist, lawyer, and editor, was the first in her Irvington district to register. But many other women were concerned that registration was really a female draft in disguise, and that the government would use the personal information they provided to assign them to national service. And if we look at the registration card, we can see why. It's impossible for you to read all these things, but what I want to suggest here is that we're looking for your identification, nationality, your citizenship, and there are these 119 skill sets, voluntary or other occupations, that people were supposed to list that they could do. There was tremendous resistance to registration. Women worried about a draft, and this newspaper article suggests another reason that women did not register. They believed that authorities had designed female registration to discover which married women could support themselves, increasing the chances that their husbands would not receive exemptions from the draft from their local draft boards. In Oregon and the nation, registration was a hearty failure because of the resistance of the majority of women. Women in Oregon and across the nation worked to canvass for voluntary food conservation as a war measure. In October 1917, all residents were to sign a food pledge to place this card and this card here in a visible place in their home window. Massive rallies and parades and posters from the Federal Committee on Public Information accompanied the neighborhood level pressure to agree to sign. Because of resistance, food administrators extended the pledge through November 10th and stepped up efforts to gain signatures at every household. The food pledge canvass could, of course, be for something else, and canvassers could observe other things besides pledging. As we can see from the Oregon Journal article, canvassers targeted unmarried boarders living together in rooming houses, broadening the net for special surveillance of residents who might have been in same-sex relationships. The records of the U.S. Attorney for Oregon contain files on the people in Multnomah County who refused to sign pledge cards. Most of them were women because they were targeted by the canvassers as consumers for households. The number, 1,907 out of about 250,000 residents, is small but significant, I think. Given the tremendous pressure to conform, the penalties not to conform, refusing was a courageous political act. You could be jailed for it. The records underestimate all those residents who were not at home during canvassing, and they're important because they reveal everyday acts of resistance to war and policy by a variety of Oregon women, including wage-earning and working-class women. These examples show you that the canvassers quoted what the people said. So what a goldmine for historians, right? They're quoting what people had to say. And in these two examples, we see women saying they don't support the war. The second woman says, I'm like the sun. I want to do things without having to be, publicized for it. There were lots of examples. Mrs. Scott told the canvasser that she doesn't believe in the war because it was brought on by greedy capitalists. Another woman closed the door saying, "Let the rich people save food." Mrs. O.G. Rowe was not in sympathy with President Wilson or his policies. She advised the workers to stay at home and do their own household work instead of peddling pledge cards to others. An African-American woman who chose not to give her name told canvassers she would not sign and that she was working for the Lord. She had an allegiance that held more importance for her than any to the Wilson administration. During the World War, Wilson's administration needed to finance the nation's participation in the war, but were unwilling to disclose the real costs, so they asked citizens and residents to purchase Liberty bonds again and again and again. This was a brutal public propaganda campaign to persuade Americans to purchase millions of dollars of bonds again and again. The participation of women in Oregon and the nation was vital to the success of wartime and post-war Liberty Loan drives. Through the National Women's Liberty Loan Committee, there were 5 drives across the war years. By the Fourth and Victory loans, women in Oregon were conducting most of the canvassing. Campaign administrators created special pins, window cards, and placards, as you can see here, for those who contributed to signify loyal citizenship. Those who did not display them or wear them were considered slackers and un-American anti-citizens. Women who helped administer and facilitate the Liberty Loan drives faced a dilemma: to count, to be seen as successful in the practice of wartime citizenship, and to be defined as loyal American citizens. They had to contribute their own labor and money to the campaigns. But they also had to count, survey, and surveil other women in the process. Their buttons and badges and the bundles of cards they carried also marked women as agents for state policies, policing other women. Oregon Women's Liberty Loan Director Sarah Evans also embraced wartime Liberty Loan drives as a demonstration of women's citizenship of shared experience, rights, and duties as co-workers with men on the loan drives. In her final report to the National Association, she said, she emphasized the respect that the men have come to have for women's work and the feeling men have that a movement of this kind is benefited by the cooperation of the work of men and women both. For many women organizers, participation became such an important way to engage in the visible practice of wartime citizenship that they did not accord other women residents and citizens the freedom of choice to participate. We can see one example among many in the case of M. Louise Hunt, Assistant Director of Portland's Central Library, right over there, who refused to buy a bond, stating, "I merely wish to claim the constitutional right privately to hold a minority opinion." Interrogators reported that Hunt claimed she would rather be raped by German soldiers than purchase a bond, a claim she denied. This depiction cast Hunt as a woman who would rather be raped than purchase a bond, or even as a prostitute betraying her country with the enemy. Her ideas and actions threatened the morality and therefore the civic safety of the city, as well as the tenets of patriotic motherhood and womanhood. Women involved in Liberty Loan work were among the loudest voices demanding that Hunt be fired or resign, which she did a week into the controversy in the midst of very vocal and violent calls. You'll see in the far right editorial cartoon that it says, "Handle roughly." And these are very violent images. She's featured in both. Under Catherine Gray's direction, members of the Oregon Federation of Colored Women's Clubs canvassed in the Liberty Loan drives, and in April of 1918, Gray organized and chaired the Colored Women's Patriotic Drive Association to gather and support Black community participation and staffing for the city's dozens of wartime projects. Women marchers, pictured here from the Rosebud Study Group, represented Black communities in a parade and public reception at Portland's Municipal Auditorium to send off 58 Black men from Portland and Oregon to Army service in Camp Lewis, emphasizing support for and the service of Oregon's Black residents. But racism continued to deny fully realized citizenship for Black women who engaged in these practices, and so Black club women challenged this by continuing patriotic activities, but also with purposeful parallel work for their empowerment as women citizens and as members of Portland and Oregon's Black communities. The Colored Women's Council of Portland published a 4-page newspaper every week called the People's Bulletin, with information on community, church, and club events. The Bulletin became the paper of record for the Colored Women's Republican Club and the State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. This is the only copy that we know of that exists. If you think of anyone who might have an attic with this in it, please contact them. Women in immigrant communities, among them Pearl Moy and Hazel Kartosian, who was part of the Armenian Portland community, shaped their own claims to female citizenship by participating, as you see here, they're both pictured on the left, in the pageantry of Liberty Loan drives and fundraising efforts. Their work emphasized the citizenship of shared experience and responsibility with white women in Oregon. The registration of German enemy aliens in Oregon resulted in the surveilling and counting of almost 4,000 people across the state. Men were required to register in February 1918, and in June 1918, registration for women. These were German citizens. Federal legislation in place from 1907 until 1922 required women who were U.S. citizens who married non-citizen men to forfeit their U.S. citizenship and take on the nationality of their husbands. Some 400 of the 1,400 Oregon women who registered as enemy aliens were U.S. born, including Viola Wilhening, who's pictured here. The 5-page form subjected registrants to a great deal of scrutiny. Newspapers expanded the surveillance by printing addresses of those who were enemy aliens. With men required to show draft cards and all enemy aliens compelled to carry registration cards with them at all times for scrutiny, most people could be stopped by law enforcement officials without cause in the growth of the wartime surveillance state. A person who today might identify as a transgender woman, known by official records as Thomas Riedel, was stopped in Oregon City in February 1918 while presenting as a woman. Police found male enemy registration papers on Riedel, brought Riedel in for questioning, and searched their house, where authorities found women's clothing, wigs, and makeup. Sensational stories, as you see pictured here, spread across the national news that Riedel was an infamous female spy, but after investigation, U.S. Attorney for Oregon Bert Haney concluded that he was nothing but a plain pervert. In a personal interview, Riedel impressed me as being of a low immoral type, Haney informed the U.S. Attorney General Thomas Gregory. Being a degenerate and addicted to wearing female clothes, I am of the opinion that he would be a dangerous man to be at large. Haney ordered Riedel's internment at Fort Douglas, Utah for the duration of the war, using penalties designed to punish enemy German aliens to persecute gender transgression instead. Riedel survived the camp and requested repatriation to Germany after their imprisonment ended with the conclusion of the war. Other registrants resisted, some by divorcing spouses, others by listing grievances and complaints while registering at police stations and post offices. Resistance sometimes took subtler forms. All enemy alien registrants had to provide 4 copies of a picture of themselves for their registration files and identification cards. Mathilde Schaefer and her daughter Pauline, both born in Germany, who came to the US in 1911, lived in Kirby, Josephine County in Southern Oregon. The Schaefers chose to define their identities as active scholars with books and papers, resisting the labeling of dangerous enemy alien and inscribing their own meaning to the image that would be used to surveil them. This very brief overview suggests the importance of considering various concepts of citizenship and gender and their interplay in the lives of diverse women in times of crisis, repression, but also possibility, such as the First World War. Organized Black women engaged in patriotic work, but also purposeful work to strengthen their communities in the midst of racism. Women in immigrant communities participated in patriotic pageantry as evidence of shared citizenship. Women such as Sarah Evans, who directed Liberty Loan work, embraced the practice of female citizenship, but also surveilled other women in the process. At the same time that we try to understand the many reasons why some women participated, it is also vital for us to remember that others resisted, and that resistance is also an important part of our history. Resistors included more visible women such as librarian M. Louise Hunt, but they also included the almost 2,000 Portland women who refused to sign the food pledge and who told the canvassers why, the women who refused to register for government service with the Council of National Defense, and the women who shaped their own responses to surveillance programs like the registration of enemy aliens. Oregon women did not succeed in stemming the tide of restrictive legislation and continuing racism in the state and nation during the First World War and its aftermath. They did not achieve equal civic status with men in this period, but various women, with their particular claims in the practice of citizenship and the citizenship of shared experience, acted to address and expand women's civic roles and equality. In so doing, these diverse Oregon women helped to connect women's equality and citizenship to the growing movement for civil rights and civil liberties in America and beyond. Thank you.
Kind of haunted. Like Kim, I also want to thank the Oregon Historical Society for this wonderful opportunity to come here and have a chance to talk with you all about a topic that, in all candor, is one that I stumbled upon unlike my two colleagues who are well-versed in American history, I stumbled onto this topic as a Russian historian. That was my background, that was my training, and now you're going to get selfish plug. Number one, my book that led me to this has just come out. It's called A Touch of Civilization. It compares Russian colonization of the Kazakhs and American colonizations of the Sioux. And in the course of that research, as a student of the First World War, I became fascinated by the parallels between the way in which Native Americans were treated by the United States government and the way in which the other belligerent states had to deal with possibly colonial troops or other indigenous populations. And so for me, coming to this topic was really an accident, but it was also a very happy accident. I found it to be a fascinating one. In part because trying to understand the whole notion of Native American citizenship, most people would have thought, well, you know, after certainly the American Civil War, they were born here. Of course they're American citizens, but American citizenship doesn't begin for them until 1924 through law. And so tonight, I want to give a little bit of background. I'm a historian. I have to give you a little bit of background to lead up to how the First World War shaped the movement for Native American citizenship. And so first, just a brief examination of the Dawes Act, because since 1887, the movement towards citizenship has been the goal of the American government, despite the numerous obstacles placed in the path of Native Americans. Then the idea of Native Americans in the military, using Native Americans not just as servicemen, but also as a means to potentially elevate them, to elevate their level of civilization in the language of the time. And then shortly before the war, the very first organizations established by Native Americans for Native American interests was organized, the Society of American Indians, and they became one of the strongest advocates. It was one of the strongest voices for citizenship for Native Americans. We'll look closely at that. And then their actual role in the war. And for the historian, this is one of the more difficult things to trace, and it has to do with how they were identified in different states and different counties in different parts of the United States. And then finally, just sort of the historical record, what we have, what historians can draw on to try and piece together part of this story. Well, from World War I, many people have assumed that citizenship was a product of Native American service. One of the things I want to argue today is that it's not necessarily the product of, it has been something that the government had been striving for since the 1880s. World War I gave the government an opportunity to then impose citizenship, despite the fact there were many Native American groups who didn't want it for a variety of rather complicated reasons. The Dawes Act of 1887, essentially what this did, this was an attempt to break up the reservations. Similar to the Homestead Act, it was designed to grant to individual Native Americans 160 acres that they were obligated to choose on their reservations. The problem was many of the reservations, for example, has anybody here ever been to Pine Ridge? Okay, Pine Ridge is in a desolate part, a beautiful part of South Dakota, but it's not conducive to agriculture. It is conducive, however, to potentially livestock raising. If you go to other reservations, whether in Nebraska or in Oklahoma or certainly in New Mexico and Arizona, many of the reservations were actually formed on some of the poorest land within the states. And so many of them were not in a position to take the 160 acres. If they decided not to take the 160 acres, the government would choose for them. All other land that was not selected would then be made available to white traders. And so one of the things that they were trying to do was to break up the tribal sovereignties, to break up the tribal affiliations, believing that the individualism would push them towards the ultimate goal of citizenship. After a certain amount of time, and they had improved the land, citizenship would be granted. There still aren't very good figures for, by let's say 1900, how many Native Americans had actually achieved citizenship. It was a small minority. In 1906, the government, trying to fix the Dawes Act, because even Charles Dawes himself, the gentleman who constructed this law, said, essentially, we've given them no education, we've given them no means in which to improve their land, and yet we're expecting them to do it and to survive on their own. The other problem is, of course, even though the United States government was no longer signing treaties with tribes, they were still obligated to adhere to their treaty rules that had been established over many, many generations. So breaking up the reservations actually further impoverished many of the Native Americans. The other thing that they would do is they would take them away to many boarding schools, but also accompanying the Dawes Act, they would open up on-reservation schools. The problem with the on-reservation schools is, of course, keeping them staffed with qualified teachers and others who were there to actually help the Indians. So you have many different means in which they are trying to essentially eliminate tribal identities. And the whole purpose behind citizenship was to make them feel American, not Sioux, not Navajo, not even Cherokee. And so one of the problems that they started to face was, of course, you also have a bureaucracy in place, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which basically was an institution that also allowed for a lot of political patronage throughout the late 19th, early 20th century. So one of the things that they started to look at was in the 1890s about trying to integrate Native Americans into the military. And they formed 2 units, and these were completely segregated, officered by white men. By 1893, it was declared a miserable failure, despite the fact that the officers in charge said these men can learn, they are educated, they are capable of becoming very, very good soldiers. The problem you also faced, though, in this period when you had those advocates for putting Native Americans in the military was a lot of the stereotypical language that you would expect, that the Native American is by nature a warrior. You're putting him in his place in life. That's what he's born to do, to be a warrior. And then many of the critics said, yes, but he's also lazy, he can't handle his alcohol. So a host of different stereotypes were being used for and against. Native Americans fought in the Spanish-American War. Native Americans served, enlisted in the Philippines and helped put down the insurrection there. But by the time we get to the First World War and the United States involvement, this is where we get to the Society of American Indians. It formed in 1911 at Ohio State University, and many of the most prominent Native American leaders were there, people such as Charles Eastman, the physician, Gertrude Bonin, certainly Carlos Montezuma and others. Many of them had been educated at elite universities in the United States. Charles Eastman, for example, full-blooded Sioux, had been educated at Dartmouth. They came together in Ohio with the express purpose of trying to become an advocate, a voice, an intellectual voice for Native Americans. Because prior to this time, most of these organizations had been chiefly formed by whites through religious institutions and others to be the voice for Native Americans. They had very few Native Americans actually serving as president or serving as the editor of a journal in any way really giving voice. They were basically, to use perhaps a wrong word, they were totems for many of these organizations prior to the 19th century. So the Society of American Indians would meet annually, started publishing a journal, and was quite popular among what I would call the intellectual Native Americans. And so it parallels what I would say were similar sort of pan movements that we see elsewhere in the world. In the early 20th century, we start to see pan-Germanism, pan-Slavism really having deep roots, pan-Turkism, certainly pan-Turkism in the Russian Empire. The problem for the Society of American Indians, though, is that the situation, the conditions on all of the different reservations varied. And so you may have Charles Eastman advocating for a certain response to the government, a full-blooded Sioux, but you may have a Navajo saying something else, or a Cherokee insisting on some other policy. In other words, the pan movement, this pan-Indian movement, was always going to fracture because the agenda was very difficult to maintain given the diversity of the experiences of Native Americans in the United States. They would meet eventually several times between 1911 and 1924. Carlos Montezuma was the editor of one of its journals. The problem is the leadership also lost touch, if you will, with what was happening on the reservation, what was happening in the lives of most Native Americans. And this is one of the journals that they published. The interesting thing with the journal is by the time the war starts for the United States, the Society of American Indians, through its journal, through its principal organ, had become a full supporter of American involvement as a means of demonstrating Native American loyalty to the United States, with the objective, ultimately, of citizenship finally being awarded to all Native Americans. And so the journal, at the time war was declared, started to encourage Native Americans using language we see quite popular in a lot of other magazine pieces and newspapers, basically asking, what have you done to contribute? Trying to guilt many Native Americans. And one of the things that happened is the question became, particularly by the time we get to June of 1917 and the registration for the draft, is can we draft people who are not citizens? And the Council of National Defense basically instructed each state and each state's Council of Defense, and then the State Council of Defense would advise the local community, the local county councils, use your best judgment. And so one of the things that would happen, and this is what makes the record so hard for historians, is oftentimes these local councils would not list a person's tribal identity. They wouldn't necessarily list their race, but sometimes they would say red. But it was varied from state to state, from county to county. And so most scholars estimate that anywhere between 12 to 17,000 Native Americans served during the First World War from across the country. But the problem is, for example, I'm co-editing a book about North Carolina during the First World War, and we asked Clyde Ellis to write a piece about Native Americans in North Carolina and their role during the war. And we have Cherokee, we have Catawba, we have Lumbee, and Clyde spent about a year going through all the archives, and he said there's no record of Native Americans serving in World War I in North Carolina, and yet we have photographs of a Cherokee on the reservation in western North Carolina in his uniform. So this is one of the problems that we face, and the reason that we are able to tackle it is because of what's known as the Wanamaker collection at Indiana University. Joseph Dixon is a fascinating individual. He wrote a book in 1913 called The Vanishing Race. Like many whites, he was convinced that Native Americans had essentially two choices. One was extinction, or the other was assimilation. And he became an advocate for preserving those things of value, the language, the culture, the religions, the mythologies. And he became a major advocate, but he was all for preserving these things because he believed that they were being lost through extinction. And after the war, one of the things that he did was he went around to different reservations, and he basically had Native Americans who had served fill out little cards telling about their experiences in the war, what they did, trying to also learn how much did they contribute to Liberty loans, did they serve in the Red Cross. And this collection is now at Indiana University, and I believe there are about 4,000 of these cards. And they tell, as you might expect, a variety of different stories. Some men stayed in the United States, some men went over to France. Some were very proud of their service, Some said, well, I could take it or leave it. I was peeling potatoes. But the reason, too, that he wanted to record this is when it was decided to integrate or to have Native Americans serve in the United States military, unlike black soldiers, Native Americans were not in segregated units. They were in fully integrated units. And so they had a very different experience than African Americans who also served during the war, and yet many of their objectives were the same. Some said, I'm doing this to advance the cause of my people. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do for my people. And this comes from Dixon's record. Many of the men who served had to observe these things. In early June 1917, all men must register. The problem was, again, for many of the local communities, determining whether or not a Native American as a non-citizen was required. In some places, agents did go out, knock on doors, say, why haven't you registered? But that was rare. In most cases, we do know that men did voluntarily go to the registration station and sign up. And many of them never heard anything else. Many did enlist. We do know of several stories of, even before the United States entered the war, of Native Americans going up to Canada to enlist in the British Army. And the Canadian government also registered First Nations people up there. So there is this record that we've been able to compile of many of these people. Sometimes they were obligated to put their tribe, sometimes they just put their county, sometimes they would put down their race, but sometimes they wouldn't. So it's a very, very difficult puzzle for us to piece together. All the while, the Society of American Indians was lobbying Congress, was advocating on behalf of the Native American. But by about 1918, Montezuma and Eastman and others had started to fractionalize, and eventually the society would splinter to such a degree that it was non-existent by about 1922, 1923. But also because of the work that they were doing, we see men like John Collier, the future Commissioner of Indian Affairs, taking up the work of Dixon and Eastman and Montezuma and others. Many did go over to France and serve. Many were killed. Many were highly decorated. But I would argue that their average sort of experience was no different than any other white soldier serving. Some were at the front, some were in the back. Some were sending pay home to their parents. Their parents were contributing to the Liberty loans and basically participating as full citizens but without citizenship. They served in many branches. Like other soldiers, they liked having their photograph taken. Also, many of us know of the rather well-known Navajo windtalkers of World War II. But in World War I, these Choctaw were used, and particularly in the Argonne and the Meuse, and the Germans were able to intercept some of these broadcasts, some of these radio transmissions, and had no idea what language they were dealing with. They'd never heard of it, even though, and this is an interesting thing, in the 19th century, as they call them in Germany, Indian stories were some of the most popular. So they knew who the Choctaw were, they knew the tribe, but they had never heard the language. And so the first windtalkers actually are in World War I, and they were very proud of their service. And many scholars have made the argument that it's a product of the success of this that in World War II gave rise to the idea of using Navajo, which was even a more, I was going to say this is really kind of a contradiction, a more less known language than Choctaw. And I love this, using the French term for the Germans, the Boche is confused by these Choctaw. They took a great deal of pride in their accomplishments during the war. These are some of the, when searching for, if you just go Google search for Native Americans in World War I, these are actually some of the photos that come up, but these are Canadian. But I thought I might as well give the Canucks, a little credit. While searching while searching some other research, I was at the University of Montana in the Mansfield Library. They have a wonderful World War I pamphlet collection there. And I encountered this book because by 1919, after the war, the initiative, the push for citizenship finally did pass Congress. But it was only for men who had served, not for all Native Americans. And in part, one of the things that started to happen was between 1919 and 1924, a lot more people took up the cause of Native American citizenship. And this, I thought, was an interesting short little work that I found that takes up the cause of both African Americans and Native Americans as a consequence of their service during the war. A lot of the stereotypical language devoted to Native Americans here, again, their warrior spirit, where once the moccasin tread, we now have the boot and the bayonet and all of these sorts of things. But it's still a fascinating attempt to lobby Congress through crediting many Native Americans with actually more than they actually did. If you read from some of the Wanamaker cards and the Dixon cards that are in Indiana, most of them will basically say, I just did my duty. I came home, if it helps my people, great, but I just did my duty. But their advocates, the society and others, were really pushing for them. So in 1919, Congress did pass legislation granting citizenship for Native Americans who served, but they had to petition for them. And oftentimes the agents on the reservations were unwilling to share that information, so many didn't even know they had this opportunity. And so in 1921-22, they continued to push for it to where we get, in 1924, Congress finally passed a law that gave citizenship to all Native Americans, regardless of whether or not they served, regardless of where they were. Many Native Americans, though, not a minority, I would say, opposed this. The fear was that by granting citizenship, it would then in some way degrade the treaty obligations, minimize the treaty obligations, maybe is a better way to put it, that the United States government still needed to fulfill, whether it was through the Bureau or some other institution. So some opposed it. Talking with some Sioux, one of the reasons they opposed it in South Dakota was they were afraid that this would actually lead to the United States government handing over the money for the Black Hills that they don't want to accept. If they accept the money, the Black Hills are gone. And so there were a lot of competing interests at work. And so many saw this as actually an attempt by the United States government not to grant citizenship, but to extricate itself from its obligations to Native Americans, seen as another attempt to worsen their condition. By the 1930s, with the Indian New Deal and John Collier, we get a real change. But in 1924, justified because of their service during the war, Native Americans were granted citizenship. This is Calvin Coolidge shortly after signing the legislation. He will travel to, for example, Pine Ridge, and he will travel in the West, meeting with Native American leaders. But what I find interesting is he's not meeting with Charles Eastman or Carlos Montezuma in a coat and tie. He's meeting with the stereotype as a way of demonstrating the benefits that have been granted as a consequence of this. And then, of course, this, one of the magazine's newspapers at the time, citizenship granted to all Indians. And so, again, some opposed it, many embraced it. For many, it didn't change their lives at all, because it might have granted citizenship, but in most cases, Native Americans didn't even have voting rights until the 1950s. So it granted something that wasn't tangible for many of them. And so it creates this sort of awkward dilemma. But the First World War is, again, part of that justification for it. If anyone is really interested, and this is sort of a sad commentary on the historical profession, this is still the best book out there for Native Americans in the First World War, written by Thomas Britton. Came out a little over 30 years ago, in the early 1980s. It's not been a topic that scholars have really started to focus on. I don't know if my contribution tonight is changing that in any respect, but I think I'm going to leave it there and say thank you for your attention.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm also delighted to be here. Thank you to the Oregon Historical Society for inviting me, and thank you to all of you for taking your evening and spending it with us. I'm going to talk about African Americans and the First World War, and I'll talk a little bit about what the U.S. looked like for African Americans before the war. I'll talk about their expectations of the war, some of their experiences, and then I'll move forward and talk a little bit about what the war meant for the subsequent Black freedom struggle. I'm going to start with this introductory story, though. When Sergeant Christopher Columbus Watts filled out his questionnaire for the Virginia War History Commission in 1920, a questionnaire you can read at the Virginia Historical Society, the Library of Virginia, he took a moment to explain what military service in the Great War had gained him. Some of it you could glean from his basic biographic data. He'd gained a sense of his own heroism. A member of the all-black 369th Infantry, the Harlem Hellfighters, he had seen action on the front in Champaign and had been awarded with medals from the French and from the city of Norfolk. More grimly, he carried physical reminders. He'd been gassed in the Argonne Forest and described himself as partly disabled as a result of his injuries. But on the final page, in a single line, he described something less tangible. Military service had carried the farmer and dock worker from Portsmouth, Virginia, on the edge of the Chesapeake Bay, to Saint-Nazaire, France, on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. His unit, known and celebrated as Harlem's Rattlers, had been comprised of Black men hailing from places as far-ranging as New York to Puerto Rico, and they'd been placed within the French army, trained and incorporated with French soldiers. Watts had moved across France, mixed with French people, seen colonial troops of color. Looking out from Portsmouth, one might suspect that the world was bigger than Virginia, less bounded than the American South, but on French soil, in the French army, one knew it. Sergeant Watts, named for Christopher Columbus himself, summed it up like this. In response to the question, what were the effects upon yourself of service overseas? He wrote, I have the world's experience. It's important to remember what the landscape looked like in 1917 as the U.S. entered the war. It was a period that historian Rayford Logan would later describe in a history book as the nadir of Black American political life. Segregation had been made constitutional 2 decades before. Disfranchisement in southern states was secured across the American South over the course of the 1890s. In the Black Belt, a system of labor control known as the crop lien system ensured that the majority of African Americans would remain in the thrall of large landowners and merchants. It was not slavery, but it was by no means truly freedom. None of these were a consequence of emancipation, we have to remember, but instead a reaction to African American political participation, a political participation that challenged both the political and economic status quo. And you'll recall the 1890s when sort of Jim Crow laws are really put into place, when white supremacy becomes a political rallying cry in the South and elsewhere, is a moment of populist upheaval, right, across the US, an agrarian revolt against a sort of consolidation of industrial capitalism in which momentarily Black farmers and white farmers come together in a biracial coalition for critique. It's this kind of solidarity, this kind of political and social efficacy that spurs white supremacy into being, that spurs the codification of Jim Crow into law. It was an assertion after the mid-60s flirtation with more expansive democracy that racialized democracy would continue to reign supreme. Its defenders, as I said, called it white supremacy. It was both a social argument and a political program. It was a Southern system at first, but it became a national compromise, a way to reunite the South with the rest of the country in the wake of the sort of mid-19th century conflict. So these things, the destruction of political power, control of black labor, these restrictive codes of behavior, were enforced through terror, both extra-legal and state-sanctioned. This is when we see in the 19-teens a resurgent Ku Klux Klan. We see horrific racial violence. By the most conservative estimates, 208 African Americans were lynched just in the first term of Woodrow Wilson's presidency alone. Another 172 would be lynched in the World War II years between 1917 and 1919. As you probably know, these aren't the secret midnight lynchings that we think about when we think about mid-century lynchings. Instead, these were big spectacles advertised ahead of time with trains running people out to the countryside to participate. Children were brought, so hymns were sung, flags were waved. These were rights of white community. Washington, in the meantime, long indifferent to the cause of African American freedom, had grown actively hostile to it. The Wilson administration segregated Washington, or entrenched segregation in Washington. It was already segregated somewhat, but what they did was to bring that segregation to the civil service, putting a cap on the number of African Americans who could be in the civil service, removing many who were, and putting a ceiling on how high those people could rise. This wasn't a limit on potential opportunity, it was actually a rollback of the gains that people had already made. So this is what the nation looks like, right? As the US gears up for war, as President Wilson goes to Congress in April 1917 and asks for the nation's support to fight a war, he says, for democracy, for the right of all nations to be at last free. Nearly 400,000 African Americans would serve in the military in this period. Millions more would register for the draft. 200,000 traveled overseas with the American Expeditionary Forces. 40,000 of them as combat troops. Those tend to be the guys that we talk about the most, but really the bulk of African Americans in the military in the war years were doing labor, building roads, felling trees, in the wake of battles, digging up and reburying the dead. Mobilization became an occasion for all sorts of African Americans, soldiers, conscripts, civilians, to claim a particular stance in relation to the nation, to Jim Crow, and to the larger world. For these people, and for the families, neighbors, lovers, and advocates who tied their fates to black military service, the war offered a crucial opportunity to challenge President Wilson's embrace of white supremacy and to make his call for a war for democracy abroad into a rallying cry for freedom rights at home. African Americans went in expecting the war to empower the black freedom struggle and to generate a new Negro. They just didn't anticipate how and at what cost. Service abroad and in stateside domestic camps didn't offer a distinct break from the dynamics of white supremacy. African Americans served, and they served well, but most of them spent more time fighting white supremacists in the US Army than they spent fighting any foreign enemy. I want you to try to think about what you know about World War I. I want you to try to imagine being part of a war that is worse than anything that had come before it, right? The brutality, the extent of the loss of life, the horrificness of the kinds of injuries that people were experiencing, the long slog. Americans came in late to the war, but to be surrounded by this kind of exhaustion, and add to that the burdens of living with and against Jim Crow. Soldiers writing letters home gave accounts of their fellow black soldiers arrested or shot for talking to French women, for lynchings and riots that they witnessed or experienced overseas, of black officers demoted for no reason except that white army authorities didn't believe that black officers could command troops. And at the same time, they're reading letters from back home about riots better described as pogroms, devastations of their home communities, attacks on their friends, on their family, on fellow citizens, of the administration's reluctance to say anything on the behalf of African Americans. So the link between the domestic struggles and the foreign experience was strong. People are talking to one another in the black press and elsewhere about what's going on. African American civilians followed along soldiers' triumphs and their tragedies. African American soldiers' morale went up and down based on the viciousness of wartime violence in their home communities. There was, too, in this period, increased state surveillance. We've talked a little bit about this or heard a little bit about this in the previous talks. It's, again, the sort of perverse benefit of the historian that these things give you so much in the historical record. So in my book, Freedom Struggles, the amount that I get about discontent on the home front that comes from the Military Intelligence Division or the Bureau of Investigation with J. Edgar Hoover already in place, obsessing about black discontent, right? The stuff, the voices that you get out of those kind of state records is really fascinating. And that surveillance is convinced that it's either the Germans who are making African Americans unhappy or after the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks, not crediting that African Americans themselves already knew all of the reasons to be skeptical about the war. But they also thought that they'd made a compact, right? They would take the surveillance, they would take the suffering, they would live with the hypocrisy, if only because they thought that the war gave them all an opportunity to demonstrate their worthiness, to demonstrate their worth, and to get more expanded citizenship rights in return. This would not happen, as you can imagine. And as African Americans, over the course of the war, began to realize that their worthiness, their faithful service, their accomplishment did not simply not bring them credit, it also generated an intense backlash. Their sense of disillusion and their militancy began to expand. I always take the opportunity to quote W.E.B. Du Bois's May 1919 crisis, editorial in The Crisis, the NAACP's monthly magazine, because I like it so much. Du Bois, who was fascinated by the war, a champion of African American soldiers, and who, atypically for him, had supported African American participation and embrace of the war effort, wrote in his disillusion an editorial that is angry, but purposefully so. In it, he decries the vindictive fate that had African Americans fighting for a dominant minority that wanted to debase black soldiers as servants, whores, dogs, and monkeys. He supplies a searing litany of ill-doing. Talking about the US, he says, it lynches, it disfranchises, it steals from us, it insults us. But in the end, he shifts from this litany to a call to arms. He says, African American soldiers fought. Under similar circumstances, we would fight again. But by the God of heaven, we are cowards and jackasses if now that the war is over, we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. We return. We return from fighting. We return fighting. Make way for democracy, he writes. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States of America, or know the reason why. Du Bois's editorial has fury, but it also had great pride and it had great hope. When I first started writing my book, Freedom Struggles, I focused on the hope. But one reads books differently in different moments. And from my current vantage point, as I wonder about the care we take, or don't, with our current crop of returning veterans, many of whom hail from marginalized and even reviled communities, and as I watch bemusedly as people reject the current assertion that Black Lives Matter in part because they don't seem to catch that that assertion is a rejoinder to the claim made in both word and deed that they do not, I better understand the hurt and the ferocity that underlines returning soldiers. Now, as I read former Lieutenant Rayford Logan's writing in his memoirs about his Jim Crow shell shock, where he wrote, I don't know, he said, I fought 2 wars at once, mine and Woodrow Wilson's, and I don't know which did more damage to me. Or when I read about Black stevedore Ely Green's accounts of watching military policemen nearly kill Black soldiers in the stockades, motivated mostly by boredom, or Green talking about being run out of Texas by the Klan for being too proud and for wearing his uniform after he'd mustered out of the army, I grasp the rage that Du Bois wrote with, rage which seared Black soldiers, either tempering them or consuming them, mobilizing them or eating them alive. But this rage couldn't flame indefinitely. It burns through, turning to despair, to indifference, or to resolve. Both Black soldiers and white supremacists knew this. In 1920, a member of the all-Black regular unit of the 24th Infantry Regiment sent an anonymous letter to the El Paso Herald warning, all colored men in the 24th who've been in France and are now in the US are going to get it. Announcing that veterans of the military service don't like the US any longer, he hinted at a plot that would surprise the world. The letter writer promised that blood would spill, with white folks getting shot down. If it took joining with the Japanese, or even going over the border to Mexico, the writer and his compatriots would do it. Anything, he wrote, to pull down your damn flag. Other African American vets had slightly more productive or palatable responses to the war. Many organized NAACP branches bloomed and increased during the war years, subsequently to be crushed again by a resurgent Klan, but to sprout back up. African Americans poured into groups like the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Some formed other groups, the Veterans Group, the League for Democracy, designed to also fight for American civil rights or civil rights in the US. Veterans like Rayford Logan, who I've mentioned, turned to scholarship. Logan actually spent several years abroad until his anger had tamped down enough for him to come back, but turned to scholarship and activism that way. Veteran Charles Hamilton Houston went to law school, became one of the architects of the NAACP legal department strategy to fight Jim Crow through legislation, trained Thurgood Marshall. Both Logan and Hamilton, when they saw World War II coming on the horizon, made a point of organizing ahead of time, this time. Part of a group called the Committee for Negroes in the Participation of the National Defense. They testified in Congress, negotiated for the rights that African Americans would gain before they went into service, rather than assuming that serving well, deserving it, would be enough. Forewarned, Charles Hamilton Houston wrote in his sort of remembrances of World War II or of World War I on the cusp of World War II, is forearmed. I'm going to stop now because I actually want you to have time to ask us questions. There's much more I could say, much more I have said in the past. So let's wind it down there and see what happens next.
I should note that books by all of our speakers are available for sale in the museum store. So if you would like to read all of the book, it's here. We have, I think we might just pull these chairs down in front of here and bring the 3 of you up, if that's all right. Oh, thanks, Kim. Questions from the audience? Sandy, you're ready. Well, it's a very quick, is it?
I just wondered if those African-American soldiers that served in World War I, I know in World War II they served in segregated units. Was that also the case in World War I?
Yes. African Americans, they served in segregated units, whether they were the combat units or the labor units. They're in segregated units, even, so technically Truman desegregates the military in 48, but even during Korea, the units are mostly segregated. It's not till Vietnam that you see really integrated units.
I really wanted to wait until other people ask questions. There's, for me, the word rollback that you used seems so contemporary for our larger struggle in the United States, that here we are talking about Native Americans, about women, about African Americans, and they move ahead, and then there's something preventing that or rolling it back. And for me, I'd like to know whether the three of you think that there's a relationship and that there's something about the American, I think I did this the last talk.
Oregon specifically last time.
Yes, right. No, but this is like American. I don't know quite character is the word, but something in our democracy that's going on that doesn't seem to allow various populations to become fully integrated.
They all have thoughts on that one.
I guess I'll start because I'm holding the microphone. What do I think? I think that as historians, as professors, we've probably all given a lecture to our students about how you should be suspicious of progress narratives, right? That the sort of like upward trajectory towards better and better feels really good, but doesn't reflect how history happens. I think what happens, though, is that you say those things and you know that you mean them, and then you feel the reminder particularly acutely at certain moments, right? So there have been a few times in my life when I've been surprised to realize that my shock about where we are in our current moment signaled that I had more faith in progress narratives than anything I say out loud would have you think. I'm a friend, a fellow historian, who talks about the protean nature of white supremacy, right? That the point of something like the Black freedom struggle or any number of social movements, sort of women's rights movements, what have you, is that you undo the kind of the tangled knot of racialized or gendered power that's in front of you in some ways, but you don't necessarily make it go away. You just wait for it to make a new knot and take what you know to work on that one. And history informs what you know, right? And history also should remind you that, circumstances change, but people don't particularly. And I don't know that sounded very cynical, but I think at some levels it's true. And I don't know that that's an American thing, except that democracy allows all kinds of participation, the kind we like and the kind that we don't, or if it just is,
I think about Sarah Evans, whose citizenship was, she felt that her citizenship was more complete because she supported the war, and that there was an element of that she took from what I described and talked about. And so if citizenship is not capacious enough, and if it is limited, then those struggles among and between people will always keep a full, complete social justice community from actually being realized. And so I don't know that there's a utopian future, but I do think that as we think about why history matters, it matters because if we think about how things work in a crisis, such as wartime or a Red Scare or a war on terror or whatever we want to choose, or a new regime, then if we are reinventing what is supposed to be citizenship and how people are supposed to behave without that historical consciousness, I think that's also a danger. So yes, and realizing that it is not, history is not progress, but it's always complex, and rights once achieved have to be continually fought for. It's a particularly difficult day today to be talking about this, right? And so I would say too that, you know, as my students come to me with experiencing fears about ICE coming to our campus, fears about a renewed onslaught for a whole variety of people who are feeling more pressure, that also then is an opportunity for us to think about, well, what happens? How do we envision crisis, and in what ways can we talk about this history so that people might have more of a sense of that? So I think, too, as long as competing citizenship and power and privilege mean that it's a zero-sum game, that some people have to lose in order for some to win, that's a problem. So.
It's kind of a complex thing for me to answer because I've spent much of my career studying Russia and the former Soviet Union. And I just say, thank God, to a question like that. And yet at the same time, in talking with friends of mine over in Russia or in Kazakhstan, places that I travel, what I am reminded of is the United States, as much as we may look on it and just ask, why are we doing it this way, or what's wrong with our democracy, or what's wrong with the system, I'm reminded that this is an extraordinary experiment that is constantly having to be negotiated, constantly evolving. Whether it's progressing forward or regressing is I think, always up for interpretation later. And when talking with friends in Russia, when I would first go over there, they would ask me, who am I? And I would say, well, I'm an American. And their first response was, no, that's your citizenship. So they automatically identified Americans due to their citizenship, not a nationality, whereas they are Russians, or they are Ukrainian, or they are German. And then they say, so, where did your family come from? And I would say, well, Sweden, Scotland, Ireland. And as soon as I would say Ireland, they would look and sigh and go, oh, you've suffered like us. Because of 1/15 Irish, right? And so, but yet at the same time, it reminded me that they acknowledged, they recognized that what the United States is trying to do is always going to look ugly, always going to have these convoluted periods that we look at and just say, can't we do better? And they would actually say, yes, you have. And, and so I take that with me, thinking of my great-grandparents came from Sweden in the 1890s. My dad's grandparents came from Slovakia, which at the time was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Whereas on my mom's side, go back to, about Mayflower time. Well, something attracted those people here for whatever reason, and whether or not we're getting it right, I don't know, but I still think, was it that Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government ever, except for all the others? And I think there's something to it. So the American democracy, while not perfect, it does seem to me it's a magnificent experiment we're trying that constantly has to be negotiated. I'll get off that soapbox, sorry.
Thank you, everyone. I have So even though I think in all of your talks there was some mention of resistance to citizenship through military service, the dominant theme sort of seemed to be the need of more marginalized identities in order to gain access to power, to sort of buy in some form or another to the military practice or sort of in participation in the military. So I'm wondering if you have any examples that you came across of people who actually claimed CO status, or who sort of took that, which seems like an additionally risky thing to do if you're a member of a more marginalized community that doesn't have access to power. It seems like you're more hemmed in to sort of buy into the traditional narrative about patriotism and et cetera. So just curious if any of you found that.
I would just say that I find it interesting that the press and people around Louise Hunt, librarian, named her a conscientious objector and saw that as something horrible. And so because I study women, I don't find a lot of that. But in my previous work, there were women who were claiming military service. And so it is for me, I haven't found any women who enlisted and then, objected after. So I haven't seen that. But I have seen labels like that of Louise Hunt, who was the librarian, and that didn't necessarily mean an objection to military service, but more broadly an objection to supporting the war.
So those military intelligence files that I was talking about earlier are chock full of people expressing skepticism in what they mistake to be the privacy of whatever environment they're in, barbershops or, after church or where have you. The pro-war folks were the loudest, right? The black press, by and large, is taking a pro-war position because the relationship between citizenship and military service is so strong in this period, right? So strong that in the South, when they're rewriting those constitutions to disfranchise African Americans, they're also disbanding black militia units because they can't figure out how to have those two things go together, right? But there are plenty of people who had no interest in or were actively opposed to the war. They weren't going to register as conscientious objectors because that would have gotten their houses burned down or kicked off of the farm or what have you. More often than not, they'd take to the hills or do it grumbly and hope that they had the kind of racist draft board that refused to draft African Americans because soldiering was an honor, and not the kind of racist draft board that was drafting all of the African Americans because they didn't want their sons going to war, right? But there are plenty of, people are taking plenty of positions. It's just in a moment when the enforcement, when mobilization requires a sort of enforcement of norms that's so intense and can have violent consequences, it took a particularly brave kind of person to step forward. So the example that people often use is A. Philip Randolph, who would go on to form the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and who's organized the March on Washington movement during World War II. In the 19-teens, he and Chandler Owen were young socialists who excoriated W.E.B. Du Bois in their magazine for telling African Americans to close ranks.
Listening to my two colleagues, it got me thinking that while there were there's a small record of Native Americans who resisted registration, what we don't have is a great archive of that information. And what little we do have, or at least that I have encountered, one of the concerns about enlisting or being drafted in leaving, if you remember that poster of, Indian land for sale, the fear was that their 160 acres or whatever they had acquired, it would fall into bankruptcy and they wouldn't be protected by federal legislation that was supposed to preserve it for them. And so there's not the record of because it was so sporadic in terms of registering many Native Americans, whether or not they didn't register due to a conscientious objection, or they just didn't go in and no one went to look for them, so it wasn't necessarily enforced. And so it's what we just don't have for Native Americans is something that on the reservation that we can really sink our teeth into. The agents were sent out, but again, if they weren't interested in registering Native Americans for the war, they weren't necessarily obligated to, because they weren't citizens. They had to make sure in the local counties that the citizens, that the men registered. There is some, particularly of the men who did fill out some of Dixon's forms. They're now housed at Indiana University, where they're saying, I'm doing this for my ancestors. So they're drawing on sort of a mythic past that they may have, that they may know these sorts of stories, saying, this is what I am supposed to do. That in other words, I don't have a choice in doing this. I'm a Sioux. I am a warrior by nature. So it's a different sort of way in which they view their own role, and that they don't have a choice but to participate, which I found sort of interesting reading some of those.
I was curious as to what opportunities there were for women during World War I to actually serve. I mean, the African American men could go in and enlist, as could the Native American. What about the women? I mean, in World War II, there were racks and waves, and a lot of the women filled jobs that the men weren't doing because they were off fighting. What you talked about was the food conservation and the Liberty loans. Were there other ways that women could, grasp a hold of that citizenship notion and actually serve?
So how much time do we in my first book, Mobilizing Minerva, I look at some of those women. Women physicians had the strongest position because they were trained, their skills were needed. They knocked on the military's door for commissions in the medical corps and were denied it. So they established all-female medical units in France. There were 2 of them sponsored by the suffrage organization and also by the Women's Medical Association. Esther Lovejoy was helped to essentially transform those units into medical humanitarian units. But there were some women who served as contract surgeons, essentially contractors, right, as doctors. There were some 11,000 women who were part of the Army Nurse Corps. African American women also active with Ada Toms, who was their leader, nursing leader. And 18 African American women are accepted into the Red Cross and into the American Army during the influenza epidemic in the fall of 1918. Then there were lots of women who wanted to be soldiers who took up arms. In Mobilizing Minerva, I talk about a lot of women's drill companies and rifle practicing. And in each of these cases, these were also women who were commenting about the violence of their intimate lives or violence of workplaces. And so some of the women who organized on the home front with guns were also talking about that they wanted to protect themselves from men on the home front as well. So there are a lot of complicated things happening, but again, this is in the context of the call for votes for women, and so the idea of what is citizenship and how might that traditionally male pursuit of military service, which had been in Western nations the way to achieve citizenship in many cases, could that also be possible for women?
This is a little bit more of a philosophical question. The theme that sort of unites the 3 of you is that war provides an opportunity or the potential for some social rectification through service. And then there's this inevitable disappointment when, it doesn't really take root. And the same story happened in World War II and in most conflicts. So my question for you is, when is the best opportunity for social progress? Is it during war or during peacetime?
As somebody who studies Russia, it's never. I'll pass it on to my two colleagues as well, but one of the things that I think certainly happens with World War I, particularly in the 1920s in the United States, but we see this also taking place in Europe, in England, in France, and elsewhere. This desire to get back to, even though things have changed, loved ones have been killed, men are maimed, and so forth. I think it's a human desire to get back to that stability that was peace and not that chaos that was war. And so the desire to sort of refocus from this total social, political, economic commitment to winning the war, because if you lose, the consequences are actually worse for, again, unless you're the Russians. Lenin always said World War I is the best thing ever to happen to us because it collapsed the capitalist economies. I think there's that real desire to return back. And so whatever the objectives of the minority group may have been, Native Americans, African Americans, women, or whatever, it's going to be very difficult, I think, to keep advancing that agenda in a situation where people are trying to return to, it's the old expression, return to normalcy, whatever normalcy might have been. I'll give it to my colleagues. They probably have far better answers than I did.
Well, I'd say the ideal time would be in a prosperous peacetime in which the community is committed to a robust notion of the common good. But I think those days might be behind us. I also think that it's hard to, because I mean, if I'm not being a slightly smart aleck, I'd say that it's hard to say broadly speaking, right? Because World War II, in many ways, the dynamic is incredibly different from World War I. Vietnam, the dynamic is different yet again. If you think about the World War I example, I'd say the detriment to civil liberties. So you have these pro-war progressives who imagine that this is a plastic juncture, as John Dewey says, in which the world can be remade, made anew. But mobilization, getting people to see a common purpose in a war that there's actually not really a reason for, means that what becomes mobilizing consent quickly gets a nasty, nasty edge that makes this idea of renewal and rejuvenation almost impossible. I'd say something different is happening in World War II. The fact that it becomes, on some level, a war against white supremacy, a war that finally allows white supremacy to become a bad word, means a different thing for domestic reform. On the flip side, it ends with nuclear weapons, right? So, I mean, all of these questions, certain possibilities open up, great costs are had, and to pretend that we can do a sort of cost-benefit analysis on that, I think, does violence to the complexity and the sort of the naughtiness of human experience, which then actually makes me come back to my first answer, which is, and I say a prosperous peace, because what people imagine is possible and what they're willing to do for others in times of prosperity is really different than what they're willing to do in times of want.
Go ahead.
Oh, please.
During the mobilization in World War I, was there a discussion about training and arming black soldiers? And was there any post-war effect? Was there any outbreak or use of arms by black returning soldiers?
Well, I'm glad you asked. So there is a discussion of training and mobilizing black soldiers. In fact, the 15th New York National Guard, which becomes the 369th, right? That unit comes to being. It's forming before the official outbreak of war, right? Sort of seeing war on the horizon. At the same time, Southern Democrats who are opposed to conscription especially, but possibly, American participation in the war more broadly, are pointing to what they think of as the insanity of arming Negroes as an argument against that. So I often quote James K. Vardaman, Mississippi senator, because he's almost like poetic in his nastiness and vitriol, and because he is perversely very insightful about African American political aspiration, because he's been guarding against it for so long. But when he argues against conscription on the floor of Congress, he basically says, if you give the Negro a gun and inflate his untutored soul with airs and tell him that it is his responsibility to fight for the US or fight for freedom, then it's just a short step to him thinking that he should bring that back home, right? He sees precisely, he's saying actually what a lot of African American militants are saying at the same time. What you see in the wake of the war, so soldiers tell stories about folks, well, military intelligence is concerned that soldiers are smuggling guns back. I don't know whether they actually were. One guy writes in his memoirs about having men in his labor battalion try to steal guns, and he makes them drop them into the ocean because he's like, we're not getting ourselves in that kind of trouble. What we do know is that when the wave of racial violence that follows World War I, what James Weldon Johnson calls the Red Summer of 1919, 25 riots in cities, Charleston, Washington, D.C., the sort of infamous Chicago riot of 1919, when mobs go in, often with white soldiers in them, mobs go into black neighborhoods bent on killing and destroying, and often doing that, burning things down. You see in many instances black vets organizing to defend their neighborhoods. Again, the most famous example is Chicago, where the 8th Illinois National Guard, which still has an armory, goes to their armory, gets arms, and does sort of defensive stances on city blocks to keep people from to lessen the number of sort of mobbers who make incursions into their neighborhood, right? So don't let anybody tell you that armed self-defense suddenly arrives in black communities in the 1960s with black power, right? It is a tradition of defense that is, more than a century old, but which black soldiers proudly reinvigorate in the wake of World War I.
Okay. Let's thank our speakers and buy their books. They may sign them for you. Thank you all so much.
It's a long way from home.